Sometimes, a single conversation in a small-town general store can change the course of a lifetime. That's where this story begins, in Millbrook, Indiana, where Thomas Brennan walked through a door one late August afternoon, and Margaret Hartley's carefully ordered world shifted just slightly off its axis. If stories of hope and second chances speak to you, consider subscribing. It helps keep these stories alive. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from today? The bell above the door chimed as Thomas stepped into Hartley's general store, his work boots leaving faint traces of field dust on the worn wooden floor. Margaret was balanced on a stepladder, restocking the top shelf with canned vegetables when she heard the sound. She glanced over her shoulder and saw him, a man in his early 30s, tall and weathered in the way that outdoor work writes itself across a person's face. His flannel shirt was faded, his jeans dusty, and there was something in his eyes that caught her attention. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of quiet recognition, as if he'd seen more of the world than most people in Millbrook ever would. "I'll be right with you," Margaret called, carefully descending the ladder. Thomas nodded, moving toward the hardware section with the familiarity of someone who'd been in this store before, perhaps years ago. He gathered a few items, nails, work gloves, a coil of rope, and brought them to the counter. As he reached for his wallet, it slipped from his calloused hands and hit the floor, scattering its contents. Photographs, a few dollar bills, and a worn military ID card spread across the floorboards. "Oh, let me help," Margaret said, kneeling beside him. Their hands moved in an awkward dance, gathering the scattered pieces of his life. Margaret picked up one of the photographs, a younger version of this man in military dress uniform, standing ramrod straight, eyes fixed on something beyond in the camera's frame. "That was a long time ago," Thomas said quietly, taking the photo from her. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Margaret felt something pass between them, a current of understanding that had no name yet. "You served?" she asked, standing. 10 years. Just got back to Millbrook 3 months ago." He gathered the rest of his belongings, stuffing them back into the worn leather wallet. "Took over my father's farm after he passed, the dairy operation out on Route 52. Margaret's expression softened. "The Brennan place. I'm sorry for your loss. You know it?" "Everyone knows everyone here," Margaret said with a small smile. "I'm Margaret Hartley. My mother and I run this store." "Thomas." He extended his hand, and she shook it. His grip was firm but gentle, the handshake of someone who knew his own strength and chose not to use all of it. "I remember you, actually. You were a few grades behind me in school. You wore your hair in braids back then." Margaret touched her hair self-consciously, now worn in a simple ponytail. "That was a long time ago. You left right after graduation. Joined the service and didn't look back. Thought I'd see the world, make something of myself." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Turns out home has a way of calling you back when you're needed." "I understand that more than you know," Margaret said. She rang up his items, her movements practiced and efficient. "I was supposed to go to college in Indianapolis. Had a scholarship to study literature. But my father died the year I graduated, and my mother needed help with the store. So I stayed." Thomas looked at her with genuine empathy. "That's a real sacrifice. Or maybe just what family does for each other." Margaret bagged his items and handed them across the counter. "That'll be $23.40. As Thomas counted out the bills, he said, "Do you ever regret it? Staying, I mean." Margaret paused, considering the question more honestly than she had in years. Some days. But then I think about what I'd be missing here, and I'm not sure the trade would be worth it. She smiled. Besides, someone has to keep this place running, and Millbrook needs its general store. Thomas nodded slowly. I suppose every town needs its anchors. People who stay when others leave. They stood there for a moment longer than necessary, neither quite ready to break the connection that had formed so unexpectedly. Finally, Thomas picked up his bag and moved toward the door. "Thank you, Margaret," he said. It was good to talk to someone who understands. "Come back any time," she replied, surprised by how much she meant it. The bell chimed again as he left, and Margaret stood behind the counter, watching through the window as Thomas climbed into an old pickup truck and drove away. She felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Curiosity about another person, a wanting to know more. She was still standing there when her mother emerged from the storage room, her arms full of inventory boxes. Eleanor Hartley was a handsome woman in her late 50s. Her hair more silver than brown now, her face lined with the kind of worry that comes from running a business through hard times and harder years. Eleanor set the boxes down on the counter, her eyes immediately going to the window where Margaret had been staring. "Who was that?" Eleanor asked, her tone casual but her posture suddenly tense. "Just a customer. Thomas Brennan. He's taken over his father's farm." The color drained from Eleanor's face so quickly that Margaret actually stepped forward, concerned. "Mother, are you all right?" "Stay away from that boy, Margaret." Eleanor's voice was low and tight, controlled in a way that suggested great effort. "The Brennans brought nothing but shame to this town. Do you understand me?" Margaret stared at her mother, stunned. In 28 years, she had never heard her mother speak about anyone with such venom, such immediate and total condemnation. "What are you talking about? What shame? He seems perfectly... I don't care how he seems." Eleanor's hands were shaking slightly as she began unpacking the boxes with sharp, aggressive movements. "I'm telling you to stay away from him, and I expect you to listen. That family is trouble, Margaret. Trust me on this." "But why? What did they do?" Eleanor's jaw tightened. "That's not something we need to discuss. What you need to do is promise me you'll keep your distance." Margaret felt a flash of frustration. She was 28 years old, had sacrificed her own dreams to stay and help her mother, and now she was being told to avoid someone for reasons that wouldn't be explained. "Mother, I can't promise to avoid a customer. He'll come back to the store. This is Millbrook. We're the only general store for 20 miles. Then be polite and professional, but nothing more. No conversations, no friendliness, no." Eleanor stopped herself, taking a breath. "Just trust me, Margaret. Please." Before Margaret could respond, her mother turned and disappeared back into the storage room, leaving Margaret standing alone behind the counter, more confused than she'd been in years. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen over the fields surrounding his property, Thomas Brennan sat at his kitchen table with a blank piece of paper in front of him and a pen in his hand. The house was silent, except for the ticking of his father's old clock on the wall and the distant lowing of the dairy cows that would need milking in another hour. He'd been awake most of the night, thinking about the conversation in the general store, about the woman with kind eyes who understood what it meant to sacrifice for family. Something about Margaret Hartley had reached past all the walls he'd built during his years away, all the careful distance he'd learned to maintain. Thomas began to write. The words came slowly at first, then faster, his hand moving across the page with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. He wrote about meeting her, about how her kindness had reminded him that goodness still existed in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving. He wrote about the farm, how it was drowning in debt his father had left behind, how the townspeople whispered when he walked past, how some nights he lay awake wondering if coming home had been a terrible mistake. "But meeting you," he wrote, "gave me something I haven't had in a long time. Hope. Just the simple reminder that not everyone in this town has already decided who I am or what I'm worth. Thank you for that. Even if we never speak again, thank you." He signed it simply, Thomas. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the fields golden, Thomas folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and wrote Margaret's name on the front. He didn't have a street address. Everyone in Millbrook knew the Hartley house, so he simply wrote, "Margaret Hartley, Millbrook Inn." After finishing his morning chores, Thomas walked the 3 miles into town, past fields turning brown in the late summer heat, past farmhouses where families were just beginning their days. He reached the post office at 8 o'clock, just as Dolores Jenkins was unlocking the front door. "Morning, Thomas," the elderly postal clerk said cheerfully. "Mailing something today?" "Just a letter," Thomas replied, handing it to her along with exact change for a stamp. Dolores looked at the address and smiled knowingly. "Well, isn't that nice? Margaret Hartley is a lovely girl. Her mother raised her right." Thomas felt his face warm slightly. "It's just a friendly letter." "Of course it is," Dolores said, still smiling. "I'll make sure it goes out with today's delivery." Thomas walked back to the farm, feeling lighter than he had in months, unaware that the letter would never reach its intended recipient. That afternoon, Eleanor Hartley was working in her garden when she saw the mail carrier's familiar blue truck pull up to the house. She set down her trowel and walked to the mailbox, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron. Among the bills and advertisements was a letter addressed to Margaret. No street address, just her name and the town. Eleanor recognized the handwriting from years of seeing James Brennan's similar scrawl, and her heart clenched. She stood at the mailbox for a long moment, the letter trembling in her hand. She thought about giving it to Margaret, about letting her daughter make her own choices. But then she remembered the pain, the humiliation of being left, of having her heart broken in front of the entire town, of watching James Brennan marry someone else just 3 months after ending their engagement. History would not repeat itself, not with her daughter. Eleanor walked into the house, climbed the stairs to her bedroom, and opened the drawer of her nightstand. She placed the letter inside, then locked the drawer with a small key she kept on a chain around her neck. As she turned the key, she told herself she was protecting Margaret. She was doing what a mother should do. But deep in her chest, beneath all the old pain and justified fears, something small and guilty whispered that perhaps she was doing something else entirely. A week passed, then another, and Thomas continued to write. Every morning before dawn, he poured his thoughts onto paper, about the farm, about his struggles, about the growing feelings he couldn't quite name. Every morning, he walked to the post office and mailed another letter. And every afternoon, Eleanor intercepted the mail before Margaret came home from the store. By the 3rd week, Thomas had returned to Hartley's general store 4 times. Each visit, he'd bought small items he didn't really need: a box of nails, a can of paint, a new work shirt, just for the chance to talk to Margaret. She was always warm, always kind, asking about the farm and listening with genuine interest when he talked about the challenges of bringing the dairy operation back from the edge of bankruptcy. But she never mentioned the letters. Not once. Thomas couldn't understand it. He'd written her 17 letters by now, each one more honest than the last, and she acted as if they'd never existed. Maybe she hadn't received them. Maybe the post office had lost them. Or maybe, and this thought made his chest tight, maybe she'd received every single one and simply chosen not to respond. Still, when he saw her behind that counter, her smile warm and her eyes bright with intelligence, he couldn't bring himself to believe she was cruel enough to ignore his words entirely. There had to be another explanation. On a Thursday afternoon in mid-September, Thomas walked into the store to find Margaret rearranging a display of canned goods. She looked up when the bell chimed, and her face lit up in a way that made his heart skip. "Thomas, hello? Let me guess, you need more nails?" He laughed, embarrassed. "Am I that transparent? You've bought enough nails in the past 3 weeks to build a barn," she said, stepping down from her stool. "What are you really building out there?" "Hope, mostly," he said, then felt foolish for saying something so honest. "The farm's in rough shape. Lots of repairs needed." Margaret's expression softened. "You're doing it all yourself?" "Can't afford to hire help. The bank's breathing down my neck as it is." He picked up a package of screws he didn't need. "But I'm managing, one day at a time." "That's all any of us can do," Margaret said quietly. She rang up his purchase, and their hands brushed again as she handed him the change. This time, neither of them pulled away immediately. "Margaret, Thomas started, then stopped, unsure how to ask if she'd received his letters without sounding strange. "Yes? Would you maybe want to get coffee sometime? The diner on Main Street?" Margaret's smile faltered just slightly. "I'd like that. But my mother, she's been unwell lately, and I don't like to leave her alone too much in the evenings." It wasn't quite a rejection, but it wasn't an acceptance either. Thomas nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. "I understand. Family comes first." "Thank you for understanding," Margaret said, and the warmth in her voice was genuine. "But I enjoy talking to you here. Please don't stop coming by." "I won't," Thomas promised. After he left, Margaret stood at the counter, feeling a strange mixture of frustration and confusion. There was something in the way Thomas looked at her, as if he was waiting for her to say or do something specific, as if there was a conversation happening that she wasn't part of. That evening, Margaret met her friend Claire Morrison at the Millbrook diner. Claire, a nurse at the county hospital, was one of the few people in town close to Margaret's age who hadn't left for bigger cities and better opportunities. "You seem distracted," Claire said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "What's going on?" Margaret hesitated, then told her about Thomas. The visits to the store, the strange intensity in his eyes, her mother's inexplicable hostility toward the Brennan family. "And the weirdest thing," Margaret added, "is that he keeps looking at me like he expects me to know something I don't. Like we're in the middle of a conversation that I missed the beginning of." Claire raised an eyebrow. "That is odd. Have you tried asking him directly?" "How do I ask someone why they're looking at me strangely without sounding paranoid?" "Fair point." Claire took a sip of her coffee. "Although, now that you mention it, I have seen Thomas at the post office a lot lately. Almost every morning when I drive past on my way to work. Always around 8 o'clock. "The post office?" Margaret frowned. Why would he go there so often? Mailing something, I assume. Though I can't imagine what needs to be mailed every single day. Claire leaned forward. Margaret, do you think maybe he's been trying to contact you somehow? But how? He knows where I work. He comes to the store all the time. I don't know, Claire admitted. But something doesn't add up. Margaret went home that night with Claire's words echoing in her mind. She found her mother in the living room, mending a tear in one of the store's canvas shopping bags. Mother, can I ask you something? Eleanor looked up, her expression guarded. Of course. Why do you hate the Brennan family so much? What did they do? Eleanor's hands stilled on the canvas. I don't hate them. Then what is it? Because the way you reacted when Thomas came to the store, I've never seen you like that before. It's complicated, Margaret. Old history that doesn't matter anymore. It matters if it's affecting how you treat people now, Margaret said gently. Thomas seems like a good man. He's struggling to save his father's farm, working himself to exhaustion, and you act like he's some kind of threat. Eleanor set down her mending, her jaw tight. Do you have feelings for him? The question caught Margaret off guard. I don't know. Maybe. Is that so terrible? Yes, Eleanor said flatly. Yes, it is. Because men like Thomas Brennan, men from that family, they make promises they don't keep. They make you believe in something, and then they destroy it. Mother, that doesn't make any sense. You're talking about Thomas like he's his father. But they're different people. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Margaret felt her frustration rising. That's not fair. You taught me to judge people by their actions, not their bloodline. You taught me that everyone deserves a chance. I taught you to protect yourself, Eleanor said sharply. And I'm trying to do that now. Please, Margaret, just trust me on this. Before Margaret could respond, Eleanor stood and left the room, ending the conversation the same way she'd ended all the others, with walls instead of answers. The Harvest Festival arrived the last weekend of September, transforming Millbrook's town square into a celebration of autumn. Booths lined the streets, selling everything from apple cider to handmade quilts. The smell of kettle corn and roasted nuts filled the air, and children ran between the stalls, their laughter bright against the cooling evening. Margaret stood near the church booth, helping to organize the bake sale, when she spotted Thomas across the square. He was standing alone near the edge of the crowd, watching the festivities with an expression that was equal parts longing and resignation. He wore clean jeans and a button-down shirt, and Margaret realized she'd never seen him in anything but work clothes. She was about to walk over to him when Claire appeared at her elbow. Is that Thomas? Yes. He looks miserable. He looks lonely, Margaret corrected. She handed the cash box to another volunteer. I'm going to go talk to him. Good. You should. Margaret wove through the crowd, her heart beating faster with each step. She was 10 feet away when she saw Thomas's expression change. His eyes finding something over her shoulder, his body tensing like a man preparing for impact. Margaret turned and saw her mother cutting through the crowd with purposeful strides, her face set in grim determination. No, Margaret whispered, but it was too late. Eleanor reached Thomas first, positioning herself between him and Margaret. When she spoke, her voice was loud enough to cut through the ambient noise of the festival. Loud enough for the people in the immediate vicinity to hear and turn their attention toward the confrontation. My daughter is not interested in you, Mr. Brennan. Please stop embarrassing yourself, and her. The conversations around them died. Margaret felt her face flush hot with humiliation and anger. Thomas stood frozen, his expression shifting from shock to hurt to something that looked like the final breaking of a man who'd already been bent too far. "Mother, stop!" Margaret pushed past Eleanor, but the damage was already done. Thomas looked at Margaret, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes she couldn't name. A question, a plea, a goodbye all at once. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't," Margaret started, but Thomas was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd that parted to let him through. Then, immediately closed behind him with whispers and knowing looks. Margaret whirled on her mother. "What is wrong with you? How could you humiliate him like that? Humiliate me?" "I told you to stay away from him," Eleanor said, her voice shaking now that the public performance was over. "I told you, but you wouldn't listen. You told me nothing. You gave me no reasons, no explanations, just orders and judgment." Margaret's voice cracked. "I'm 28 years old, Mother. I'm not a child you can control." Several older townspeople had drifted closer, pretending to browse nearby booths while clearly listening. Margaret recognized Mrs. Patterson from the church, Mr. Hendricks, who owned the hardware store, and several others whose families had been in Millbrook for generations. They were nodding in agreement with Eleanor, their expressions suggesting they knew something Margaret didn't. "You don't understand what his father did to this town," Eleanor said, lowering her voice. "To our family." "Then tell me." "It's not—" Eleanor pressed her hand to her forehead, suddenly looking older and more fragile than Margaret had ever seen her. "Please, just trust me. You don't know what you're getting into with that family." Margaret looked at her mother's face, at the genuine fear there mixed with something else. Old pain that had never healed. For a moment, her anger softened into confusion. "I can't trust you when you won't be honest with me," Margaret said quietly. "About anything." She left her mother standing in the square and drove home alone, her mind reeling. She couldn't stop thinking about the look on Thomas's face, the public humiliation, the whispers that would follow them both through town now. She also couldn't stop thinking about the post office visits Claire had mentioned, about Thomas's expectant looks, about the feeling that she was missing crucial pieces of a puzzle that everyone else could see. That night, lying in bed, Margaret made a decision. Tomorrow, she would drive out to Thomas's farm and apologize. She would demand answers. She would figure out what was happening, with or without her mother's approval. She fell asleep planning what she would say, unaware that in a locked drawer just down the hall, 23 letters were waiting in the darkness, holding answers to questions she didn't even know to ask yet. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the first real hint of the coming winter. Margaret left the house early, before her mother woke, leaving only a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to run errands. Back this afternoon." The drive to the Brennan farm took 15 minutes along country roads lined with dying cornfields. Margaret had been out this way only once before, years ago, and she'd forgotten how isolated the property was. No neighbors for at least a mile in any direction, just rolling fields and the occasional stand of trees breaking up the horizon. When she turned onto the long gravel driveway, her heart sank. A bright orange foreclosure notice was posted on the barn door. The words, "Final Notice," visible even from a distance. The house itself looked tired, its paint peeling, several shingles missing from the roof. A few dairy cows stood in a muddy pen, their ribs showing through their hides. This wasn't just a struggling farm. This was a dying one. Thomas was sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands, his shoulders curved inward in a posture of complete defeat. He didn't look up when Margaret's car pulled into the yard, didn't move even when she shut off the engine and climbed out. "Thomas?" she called softly. He lifted his head slowly, and Margaret's breath caught. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face haggard. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, or perhaps had finally stopped fighting sleep and found only nightmares waiting. "Margaret?" His voice was rough, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "I came to apologize. For my mother. For last night. For..." She gestured helplessly. "For all of it." Thomas stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You don't need to apologize for her." "Yes, I do. What she did was cruel and unfair, and you didn't deserve it." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe I did. Maybe she's right about me." "She's not," Margaret said firmly. "I don't know what happened between our families in the past, but I know you're not responsible for it." Thomas walked down the steps, stopping a few feet away from her. In the gray morning light, he looked older than his 31 years, worn down by burdens that should have been shared, but instead had been carried alone. "Did you get any of my letters?" he asked suddenly. Margaret blinked. "What?" "My letters. I've been writing to you, mailing them to your house." He studied her face carefully. "You really don't know what I'm talking about, do you?" "Thomas, I haven't received any letters from you. Not one." Something shifted in his expression. Shock giving way to understanding, then to anger that wasn't directed at her. "How many days has it been since we met? Since that first day in the store?" Margaret thought back. "About 6 weeks, maybe a little more." "I've written you 47 letters, Margaret. 47. One every single day." His voice was quiet but intense. "I poured everything into those pages. My thoughts, my fears, my feelings about you. And you never got a single one?" Margaret felt the world tilt slightly. "That's not possible. Who would..." But even as she said it, she knew. The anger in her mother's eyes. The strange protectiveness. The locked bedroom door she'd noticed lately. The way Eleanor had been checking the mail before Margaret got home from the store. "Oh, God," she whispered. "She's been intercepting them," Thomas said. And it wasn't a question. Before Margaret could respond, she heard the sound of another car coming up the driveway. Both of them turned to see Eleanor's sedan pulling in behind Margaret's car, gravel crunching under the tires. Eleanor emerged from the vehicle, her face pale but determined. "Margaret, get in the car, now." "No." Margaret's voice was steady despite the fury building in her chest. "What have you done?" "I'm protecting you, just like I've been trying to..." "Where are they?" Margaret demanded. "Where are the letters?" Eleanor's silence was answer enough. Thomas took a step forward, his hands clenched at his sides. "You had no right. Those weren't written to you." "I have every right to protect my daughter from men like you," Eleanor shot back. "Men who make promises they can't keep, who build up hope just to destroy it. Just like your father did to me 30 years ago." The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret stared at her mother, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed suddenly clicking into place. "You and Thomas's father?" Margaret said slowly. Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. "We were engaged. I loved James Brennan with everything I had. We were planning our wedding, our life together. And then, 3 months before we were supposed to marry, he broke it off. No real explanation, no apology. Just a cold ending. 2 weeks later, he was courting someone else. A month after that, he married her." She pointed at Thomas. "His mother." Thomas looked stricken. "I didn't know. My father never..." Of course he didn't tell you, Eleanor said bitterly. Men like him never take responsibility for the hearts they break. And now his son comes back to town, and I'm supposed to stand by while history repeats itself? While you break my daughter's heart the same way? I'm not my father, Thomas said, his voice breaking. I've spent my whole life trying not to be him. And those letters, God, those letters were the most honest I've ever been with anyone. They were me trying to do the opposite of what he did. To be open, to be truthful, to not hide or run away. Margaret felt tears streaming down her own face now. You had no right to keep them from me, Mother. They weren't yours to take. I was protecting you. From what? From someone who might actually care about me? From someone who was brave enough to be vulnerable? Margaret's voice rose. You weren't protecting me. You were punishing him for what his father did, and you were punishing me for having the audacity to feel something for him. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking small and fragile. You don't understand. The pain I went through when James left, it nearly destroyed me. I can't watch you go through that. Then don't make me go through it, Margaret shouted. Don't create the exact situation you're afraid of by driving away someone who's been trying to reach me for weeks. The three of them stood in the farmyard, the gray sky pressing down on them, the foreclosure notice flapping in the wind like a wounded bird. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice hollow. It doesn't matter anymore. What? Margaret turned to him. He gestured at the barn, at the house, at the fields beyond. The bank's taking the farm. I have until the end of the week to clear out. I can't make the payments, can't keep up with the debt my father left. Even if I could, everyone in this town has already decided who I am based on my last name. He looked at Eleanor. You're not the only one who wants me gone. Thomas, no. Margaret started. I'm leaving Millbrook, Margaret. I have a friend in Richmond who says I can stay with him, find construction work there. Start over somewhere nobody knows the Brennan name. He smiled sadly. Maybe your mother's right. Maybe that's what I should have done from the beginning. You can't just give up, Margaret said desperately. I'm not giving up. I'm accepting reality. He looked at her with such tenderness that it hurt. I'm sorry I dragged you into this. You deserve better than to be caught in the middle of old family drama that has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me now, Margaret said. But Thomas was already walking back toward the house, his shoulders hunched against the weight of too many losses. Margaret moved to follow him, but Eleanor caught her arm. Let him go, Margaret, please. Margaret pulled her arm free. I won't. Not like this. She ran after Thomas, catching him at the porch steps. Wait. Please, just wait. He turned, and she saw in his eyes that he'd already left, even if his body was still standing there. What do you want me to say? He asked quietly. I want you to tell me what was in the letters, all 47 of them. Thomas closed his eyes. It doesn't matter now. Yes, it does. Because I never got to read them, and you never got to hear my response. We've been having a one-sided conversation for 6 weeks, and that's not fair to either of us. She took his hand, feeling his calluses, the evidence of his endless work. So tell me, please. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then finally he spoke. I told you about the farm, about how every morning I wake up knowing I'm one bad day away from losing everything. I told you about my father, about the debts he left behind, both financial and social. I told you about the military, about the things I saw that I wish I could unsee. He paused. And I told you that meeting you was the first time in 10 years that I felt like maybe I wasn't just surviving. Maybe I could actually live again. Margaret's throat tightened. What else? I told you that you were beautiful. But not in the way everyone says that word. Beautiful in the way a home is beautiful when you've been away too long. Beautiful in the way that made me want to be better, do better, try harder. He finally opened his eyes and looked at her. And in the last few letters, after you never responded, I told you I was falling in love with you anyway. Even though I knew it was foolish. Even though I knew you probably didn't feel the same way. The tears came freely now. I never got to read them. I never got to tell you. It's okay, Thomas said gently. You don't have to say anything. I understand. No, you don't. Margaret wiped her eyes roughly. I'm not saying this out of pity or obligation. I'm saying it because it's true. I've been drawn to you since that first day in the store. I kept hoping you'd come back, kept watching for you. And I couldn't understand why you seemed to be waiting for something from me. Why you looked at me like I'd disappointed you somehow. Now I know it was because you were being honest and vulnerable and brave. And it looked like I was just ignoring all of it. Thomas's expression shifted, hope warring with disbelief. Margaret, I don't know if what I feel is love yet, she continued. I haven't had time to figure that out. But I know it's something real, something worth exploring. And I'm not going to let my mother's pain from 30 years ago decide what happens to us now. Behind them, Eleanor had walked closer, listening. When Margaret turned to look at her, she saw her mother crying silently. I'm sorry, Eleanor whispered. I'm so sorry. I need those letters, Margaret said. All of them, every single one. Eleanor nodded shakily. They're at the house, in my nightstand drawer, and... She stopped, swallowed hard. And in other places. I kept moving them as more came. I didn't know what else to do with them. I couldn't throw them away. But I couldn't give them to you either. How many? Thomas asked. Eleanor looked at him. I stopped counting after 60. They just kept coming, day after day. I've never seen anyone so persistent. 183, Thomas said quietly. That's how many I've written, including the one I wrote this morning before I knew Margaret was coming. The number hung in the air between them, a monument to dedication, to loneliness, to hope maintained against all evidence. Margaret turned back to Thomas. I want to read them, all of them. Will you wait? Will you give me time to catch up on 6 months of conversation I missed? The bank? We'll figure it out, Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. There has to be a way. Maybe we can talk to them, work out a payment plan, find investors, something. But I need you to not disappear. I need you to stay, at least long enough for me to read your words and give you mine in return. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret saw the exact instant he decided to believe again, to take one more risk on a possibility that had already hurt him so many times. Okay, he said. I'll stay. Margaret drove back to town with her mother following in the other car. They didn't speak during the drive, but when they arrived at the house, Eleanor went straight to her bedroom. Margaret waited downstairs, her heart pounding, until she heard her mother's footsteps on the stairs. Eleanor descended carrying a large cardboard box, her arms straining under the weight. She set it on the kitchen table, and Margaret saw it was filled with envelopes. Stacks and stacks of them, some tied with ribbon, others loose, all addressed in Thomas's careful handwriting. This is all of them, Margaret asked. Yes. Eleanor couldn't meet her eyes. I'm sorry, Margaret. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am so sorry. Margaret picked up the box. It was heavy with words, with time, with the weight of one person's heart laid bare page after page after page. I need you to understand something, Mother, Margaret said. I love you. I know you were trying to protect me from pain, but you can't protect people from life. All you can do is be there when the pain comes, help them through it, not prevent them from ever taking a risk at all. I know, Eleanor whispered. I know that now. Margaret carried the box upstairs to her room and closed the door. She sat on her bed, opened the first letter, and began to read. Hours passed. The sun tracked across the sky, afternoon fading into evening. Margaret read about the farm, about loneliness, about hope and fear and the small moments that had caught Thomas's attention. A bird building a nest in the barn, the way morning light looked on frost, the memory of her smile. She read about his father, about the complicated relationship between a son and a man who'd left too many broken things behind. She read about war, about coming home, about the strange grief of returning to a place that had moved on without you. And she read about herself, about how Thomas saw her, noticed her, thought about her. Every letter was a window into a mind that was thoughtful, funny, sometimes painfully honest. He wrote about his doubts, his fears that he wasn't good enough, his confusion when she never responded. By the time she finished the last letter, number 183, written just that morning, tears were streaming down her face, and the sun had set outside her window. She sat in the darkness for a long time, holding the letters, feeling the weight of them. Then she turned on her lamp, pulled out a notebook, and began to write her own letter, her first of what she hoped would be many. The next morning, Margaret drove back to the Brennan farm. She found Thomas in the barn, mucking out stalls, preparing to move the remaining cows to a neighbor's property. He looked up when she entered, hope and fear warring in his expression. I read them, Margaret said simply. All of them. And? She walked to him, closing the distance between them until she was close enough to see the flecks of gold in his eyes. And you were right. About all of it. How you felt, what you saw in me, what you wanted. You were right. Thomas's breath caught. Margaret, I wrote you a letter too, she said, pulling the folded pages from her pocket. It's not as eloquent as yours. I only had one night instead of 6 months. But it's honest. He took the letter with shaking hands, but didn't open it. Will you tell me what it says? It says that I'm angry at my mother for stealing 6 months from us, but I'm also grateful because now I get to know exactly how you think, what matters to you, who you are when you're alone with your thoughts. Most people date for years and never know each other that well. What else? It says that I don't want you to leave Millbrook, that we'll figure out the farm somehow, together, that you're not alone anymore. She paused. And it says that I'm falling in love with you too. Not with who I thought you were, but with who you actually are. The person in the letters. Thomas closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with tears. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you. Yes, you do, Margaret said firmly. You deserve someone who sees all of you and chooses to stay. And I'm choosing to stay, Thomas, if you'll let me. He reached out slowly, as if afraid she might vanish, and cupped her face in his calloused hands. They stood like that for a long moment, in the dusty barn with morning light streaming through the gaps in the walls, and Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not the sudden lightning strike of romance stories, but something steadier. A foundation being laid, brick by brick, word by word. "I'll keep writing," Thomas said softly. "Every day. But now you can write back." "I will," Margaret promised. "Though I can't guarantee mine will be as beautiful as yours. They'll be perfect because they're from you." Over the following weeks, things began to change. Margaret convinced the bank manager, a friend of her mother's, to review Thomas's case. She presented a business plan she'd been working on. Ways to modernize the farm, potential investors, a realistic timeline for profitability. The bank agreed to a modified payment schedule, giving Thomas 6 more months to prove the farm could be saved. Eleanor, to her credit, didn't interfere. Instead, she did something more difficult. She apologized to Thomas directly, explaining her past without using it as an excuse. Thomas listened, then forgave her with a grace Margaret found remarkable. She lost someone she loved, Thomas told Margaret later. "I understand that pain, and she was trying to protect you from it, even if she went about it the wrong way. That's not unforgivable." The town gossip eventually died down. People in Millbrook loved a good story, but they loved a good redemption more. Seeing Thomas and Margaret together, seeing them work side by side to save the farm, seeing the quiet way they cared for each other, softened even the hardest hearts. 3 months after Margaret first read the letters, on a cold December evening, she and Thomas sat together in his farmhouse kitchen. The farm was stable now, not thriving yet, but no longer dying. The cows were healthier, the repairs were progressing, and there was actual hope for the future. Thomas had continued to write her letters, even though they saw each other nearly every day now. Margaret had started writing back, finding her own voice on the page, her own way of being vulnerable. "I have something for you," Thomas said, sliding an envelope across the table. Margaret smiled. "Another letter?" "The last one, actually. For now, anyway." She opened it carefully, unfolding the single page. The letter was short, just a few paragraphs. But the words made her heart skip. "Margaret," it began, "I've spent 6 months writing you letters, trying to find the perfect words to explain how I feel, what you mean to me, why you've changed everything. But I've realized that some things don't need perfect words. They just need truth. The truth is, I love you. Not because you saved my farm, though you did. Not because you gave me hope, though you've done that too. I love you because you chose me when it would have been easier not to. You chose to believe in possibility even when everything said it was impossible. I want to spend the rest of my life writing you letters, Margaret. Love letters and grocery lists, birthday cards, and notes left on the kitchen table. But more than that, I want to spend my life showing you, day after day, that you made the right choice. I don't have a ring yet. The farm has to come first for now, and I want to do this right. But I wanted you to know. I'm asking you to marry me. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday soon, when you're ready. When we're ready. I just needed you to know that's where my heart is. That's where it's been since the day I dropped my wallet in your mother's store, and you helped me pick up the pieces. You helped me pick up all the pieces, Margaret. Let me spend my life doing the same for you. All my love, Thomas." Margaret looked up from the letter, tears in her eyes, to find Thomas kneeling beside her chair. "I know it's too soon," he said. "I know we're still figuring things out. But I needed you to know that's where this is heading. That I'm serious about you, about us, about building a life together." Margaret set the letter down and took his hands in hers. "It's not too soon. The answer is yes." Not someday. Now. Yes. Thomas's expression shifted from nervous to stunned to joyful in the space of a heartbeat. Really? Really? Margaret laughed through her tears. We've already done everything backward. Why start being conventional now? He stood, pulling her up with him, and they held each other in the quiet kitchen while winter wind rattled the windows and the farmhouse settled around them with comfortable creaks. I'm going to keep writing you letters, Thomas murmured against her hair. Good, Margaret said. I've gotten used to them, but now I get to respond in person. Even better. They stood there in the warmth, in the light, in the knowledge that some journeys require patience and persistence, that some love stories don't begin with a bang, but with a whisper that grows stronger with each passing day. Outside, snow began to fall, the first real snow of winter, covering the fields and the farmhouse and the town beyond in a blanket of white. It covered the past, softened the edges of old pain, and made everything look new again. Inside, Thomas and Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the box of letters between them. 183 pieces of paper that had saved them both. They read them together now. Margaret hearing them in Thomas's voice, Thomas seeing them through Margaret's eyes. And when they finished, they started writing new ones. Because some stories don't end. They just keep unfolding, page after page, word after word, day after day, until the letters themselves become less important than the life they helped create. And that life, that was worth every word, every mile walked to the post office, every moment of hope maintained against impossible odds. Sometimes the longest journey isn't measured in miles, but in the courage it takes to trust again and to forgive. Sometimes love requires patience, persistence, and the simple faith that somewhere, somehow, your words will reach the person they're meant for. Thomas and Margaret learned that lesson the hard way. But they learned it together, one letter at a time, until the distance between them disappeared entirely, and all that remained was the simple truth of two people choosing each other, again and again, with every word they wrote and every day they lived. That, in the end, was the greatest love letter of all.